president of the Heritage Foundation. I want to get into Project 2025. Donald Trump was saying,
I don't know anything about it. I don't want to know anything about it.
Kamala Harris, on the other hand, says
that the former president intends on implementing if he were elected again.
Who's lying?
The best way to make sense of that dichotomy is
what was the mischaracterization by the Democrats?
Something they spent probably $75 million on.
Trump characterized you as severe right. Was he wrong? National abortion ban. This is something that...
And it just doesn't exist in Project 2025. That's like the greatest lie.
The other big topic is immigration. How is he going to deport millions of illegal immigrants in America?
I see 2 or 3 steps unfolding.
Can I ask about these new appointees?
Actually, I think it's a brilliant pick by Trump, showing that he wants to keep the conservatives together on this issue. We are going to take back America. And it's going to be in part because of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, but most of all, it's going to be because 80 million Americans decided that the gig is up.
In this episode, I spoke to Dr. Kevin D. Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation, who are behind the famous or infamous Project 2025. Before you hear from Dr. Roberts, I ask, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press like and subscribe. If you do that, I'm going to have more phenomenal guests like Dr. Roberts exploring the issues that you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, Kevin Roberts. Dr. Roberts, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and sit with me. There's lots to discuss. I want to get into your book. Congratulations on the Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America, in which you say we need to burn down the institutions and that America is going through a second American Revolution. I'm very excited to talk about all of that. But being the president of the Heritage Foundation, you're in the news because Project 2025 and some of its authors are being appointed by your president-elect Donald Trump to positions. So I want to start with that, if I may. Firstly, welcome and thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Look, this is the first conversation I'm having in Great Britain about the book, about American politics, far more important than the book. And I mean this. I know I'm not supposed to compliment as an American a Brit, but I'm going to compliment you. Thanks for doing this. It's a real pleasure, and I look forward to the conversation.
Oh, it's a pleasure is mine. So let's start with the thing that it seems unbelievably glaring to me, which is that throughout the presidential election, on the one hand, Donald Trump was saying he had nothing to do with the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. He called Project 2025, he said it's severe right, I think was the word. He's very, very conservative, the opposite of the radical left. And you're the radical right. Maybe you have some good ideas, maybe you have some bad ideas. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, he's now appointing Project 2025 authors. In your book, J.D. Vance, Vice President-elect, says, very complimentary, but the Heritage Foundation isn't some random outpost on Capitol Hill. It is and has been the most influential engine of ideas for Republicans from Ronald Reagan to Donald Trump. Kamala Harris, on the other hand, says that absolutely it's completely tied together. Project 2025 is absolutely part of the agenda. So I want to get into Project 2025, but it seems either Kamala is lying or Trump's lying. Who's lying?
Well, I'll leave that assessment to the audience and tell you what we know. I can't speak for either of them. Obviously, we're very much aligned philosophically with President-elect Trump. Great ideas and great people rise to the top, Winston, and that's what's happening with the appointments of these cabinet secretaries and very likely great men and women, whether they were officially part of our project or not, going into the cabinet. But to your point, the best way to make sense of that dichotomy is that when President Trump's campaign disavowed, to use the verb that the regime media and the states used, Project 2025, that was not news to us because we exist in our own lane, so to speak. He's trying to win a campaign. He's got political considerations. And when I spoke to him shortly after that comment, it was obvious to me that he just needed the radical left's mischaracterization of our work to get out of the way so that he could win the election. And the mischaracterization by Kamala Harris's campaign is something they spent probably $75 million on. We spent, a few $1 million putting the project together. So all that to say, to drive home this point, now we're in the policymaking season. This is why a Heritage Foundation and the 110 organizations that are part of Project 2025 exist. And therefore, it's not a surprise now that President Trump would be appointing people from Tom Homan, who's a Heritage Foundation fellow, to Russ Vought, who's at the Center for Renewing America, probably the closest collaborator in Project 2025 to be his director of management and budget. And ultimately, we're gratified at Heritage and at Project 2025 that the American people realize it's time to get to work. It's time to go implement policy. And we're very optimistic because he's using our people.
Dr. Roberts, I'm keen to ask you about these people and what we think their talents are and what they might achieve. But what was the mischaracterization by the Democrats of the Heritage Foundation that you're referring to?
The Democrats said that the Project 2025 was intertwined with the Trump campaign. Actually, under federal law, under American law, it can't be. We have a particular legal structure, and I'll go into the weeds on this. We have a particular legal structure that wouldn't allow us to be part of a campaign. So for her, just saying bluntly that it's one and the same, the Trump campaign and Project 2025 are one and the same, simply is false on its face. But then the second thing is she spoke and sometimes hinted at a certain coordination that was going on between the campaign and Project 2025. We also couldn't do that. We're independent at Heritage of any political candidate. I think for the casual observer, they would look at President Trump's Agenda 47, which was his platform, and they would look at the issues that we talk about in Project 2025, and they would say, oh, they're very much the same. Well, they're the same because we're both political conservatives. And ultimately, you have to ask why she did this, and it's because she couldn't run on her own record, which was terrible.
Right. But, okay, so then when Trump categorized you as severe right, was he wrong? Is that correct?
Trump was trying to run as a center-right candidate, and we at Heritage are unabashedly conservative. And so from issues such as life, on which we have respectful differences of opinion with the president-elect, large agreement, but some differences of opinion.
Life, you mean abortion rights?
Yes, that's right. To other issues, the president thought that it was very important for him in the campaign, where he had to appeal to independent voters, to distance himself from those issues that he thought were more conservative than he wanted to be. That's what I mean, Winston, when I referred to the political season. Politicians make these considerations. They have a lot more to do with messaging than they have to do with the substance of the matter. Now that we're in the policy-making season, we're focused on the substance of the matter. We're able to get to work.
So the messaging was not true?
I'm not going to say that it's not true. I'm going to say that those were political considerations.
And he called you after you spoke to him after that?
We spoke a couple of times during all of that.
So even though he's distancing himself from you, he's also speaking to you on the phone after?
Yeah.
Right.
This is how politics work. And that's why sometimes people who are, real avid supporters, aficionados of Heritage, of Project 2025 are saying, oh my gosh, what's the sky's falling. And my response always was, no, it's not. We're going to get to the end of the presidential campaign. I think Trump and Vance are going to win. I was saying this in August and September. And we will get the opportunity to have our ideas and people be consulted. And that ultimately is going to be the choice of the president-elect and vice president-elect, but I have confidence in our ideas and our people.
I want to get into the ideas, but just so I've got this right. So Kamala was not correct when she said that you guys were absolutely intertwined.
She's 100% false about that.
But she's not wrong to say that you guys are part of the same movement. And Trump did say in 2022 that the Heritage Foundation was a great group, that it was laying the groundwork for the MAGA movement.
100%.
So it's not wrong for Kamala to have said that you guys are it's part of the same movement.
No, it isn't. But just to press on that a little bit, that's not newsworthy. That's sort of an absurd assertion. What she was attempting to do is create a smoke and mirrors campaign to hide her own record, which was terrible on the economy, was terrible on immigration. Frankly, it was terrible on abortion as well. And that, I think, she succeeded in doing for 3 or 4 or 5 weeks. But ultimately, to this point about why it's absurd that she would even make it an issue, even her own voters started saying, why are you talking about this? This is what think tanks do. They're the largest conservative think tank in the world. Of course, there's going to be some overlap between them and the conservative candidate for president.
But then what's curious is, and forgive me for hammering this, but
it's okay.
Why would Trump then distance himself to you if it's just a think tank? All political parties and political movements have think tanks behind them. That's not controversial. That you are conservative, that's not controversial.
Great.
So why would Trump bother distancing?
Yeah, great question, because we've never done this project on this scale. Usually what we would do is have a Heritage Foundation only set of policies, which we call the Mandate for Leadership. We've done this every 4 years since 1980 for President-elect Reagan. But what we did this time, which is a real threat to the power that the left has accrued in Washington, is put together a personnel database for people, men and women, Americans who want to serve in the presidential administration. And that is directly targeted at the power center of the left. And that's why Kamala, I think, saw this as an opportunity to undermine that however she could, whether it was telling the truth, whether it was telling lies, which is what her campaign did. And now
But it sounds like Trump's also telling lies.
No, I think Trump was talking about the importance in the political season of the reality, which is that his presidential campaign, like the legal structure of his presidential campaign, and the legal structure.
He said everything. He completely distanced himself.
Well, that's how Trump talks. But I'm just telling you why that couldn't be the case, that the Trump campaign and Project 2025 could be the same thing.
Sure.
It's like saying water could be air. It can't be under American law.
But it is part of the same movement. So but
that's not newsworthy. It's like saying that Winston and Kevin get along.
It's not newsworthy, but then I'm confused by why Trump would distance himself from you. Why wouldn't he yeah, these are great. J.D. Vance, for example, is very proud.
Because the left was spending $75 million on this campaign, and it was frightful to the Trump campaign that from their perception in early mid-July, it looked like the Project 2025 was something they really needed to run from a marketing standpoint, from a PR standpoint.
Right, but then, okay, so it'd be interesting to get what exactly is so controversial that, because Trump could also have just said, well, actually, there's nothing wrong with Project 2025.
He could have. That was one option.
I agree with it. And I think a lot of people viewing want to understand Project 2025. It's a 900-page thing. So I guess you would call it manual or so probably not. Most people haven't read it. I would say even probably most journalists haven't read it.
Oh, I can guarantee you that.
Yeah. So it'd be interesting to get into the things that were controversial enough that Trump, it seems to me, made a decision instead of saying, yes, I'm with Project 2025, decided instead to say, no, I have got nothing to do with Project 2025. It seems to me that he did have something to do with Project 2025, that he's linked, given the hires he's making. So
the links are informal. I think
they're informal,
yeah,
but they're existent. They exist.
Yeah, but I don't understand why that's newsworthy, even to this day.
But it's newsworthy that he's distancing himself from you. That's weird to me.
Well, it makes a little more sense. I understand why it's weird to you.
Mm.
It makes a little more sense to me and conservatives in the United States who were being bombarded with all of these political advertisements by the Kamala Harris campaign. So if you're President Trump and you're trying to win this campaign that's got really narrow margins, and the rationale both for the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign was that you needed to win a majority of independents. And if independents in the United States thought, whatever their issue, whatever their stance is on abortion, for example, we don't want to talk about it. Well, Heritage is a pro-life organization. And I think that was probably if you're searching for that issue, that was the one that President Trump felt politically he needed to distance himself from amid the campaign. That was probably it.
Well, I guess maybe we should start with the abortion aspect of it, because that was for women, young women in particular, the most important issue in this presidential election. Am I wrong? What was more important for you?
The economy actually was the most important for Americans,
Americans, young women. So at least one Wall Street Journal assessment I saw polling said that for young women it's about 25%.
I think it's important to be precise,
yeah.
and not that you're trying to overstate this, but I think it's really important to be precise. It's a very tiny sliver of young women for whom abortion was the number one issue. In fact, it's a big difference between the 2022 midterm elections in the United States and 2024. And that's actually apropos of this conversation we're having, is that the Harris campaign thought they could win by making the abortion issue their trump card, pardon the pun. But in fact, it didn't, because the economy was so bad, because of Americans, including suburban women, older, admittedly, than the demographic you're talking about. A majority of them voted for Trump. And one of the secondary or tertiary reasons we believe they voted for Trump was because the demonization by the Harris campaign of pro-lifers, of President Trump's position, of our position in Project 2025, they thought was evidence of just having a tin ear. That, in fact, they were ready to move on from that issue. They saw it as settled under the Dobbs decision. And it was Trump and Vance who they thought did a very good job of saying, we're moving on. But it was a left that was really, really focused on it. And it worked, but still, Winston, only barely for that small demographic.
But so Trump himself, forgive me if I'm being slow on this, but so he decided the main reason to distance himself from Project 2025 publicly, even though he was privately calling you, was because of the hot issue of abortion within the Project 2025. It does seem like that was the most controversial thing from the point of view of the left.
Yes, my speculation is that was if there was a policy issue that was driving the concern, it was that one.
Okay, so what is the Project 2025 position on abortion, and is that different from Trump's position?
It is different from Trump's position. President-elect Trump wants or perceives the Dobbs decision as turning abortion decisions entirely to the states. And Heritage and most of
Which
our—
is what it is currently.
No, there's the rub.
Yeah,
there's the rub. We believe at Heritage, and including our legal scholars, that the federal government still has a role in determining abortion. For example, passing a partial birth abortion ban should happen at the federal level. We also foresee a world, maybe it's 5 or 10 or 25 years down the road, once we get the southern border closed and the economy fixed, when we might see a 15-week restriction on abortion like most European countries have. We believe that, just real quick, if I may,
go on.
We believe that should happen at the federal level rather than giving it to the states, so that you don't have California, New York, and the more liberal states ultimately pass the bills that they have heard in committee, which is abortion up to the point of birth, which is hard even to say, let alone contemplate.
So what does partial birth abortion mean? I haven't heard that term before.
In the United States, partial birth abortion, and I'll tell you what the sort of political issue is in the United States. Partial birth abortion is when a baby is viable, and there is a particularly grotesque procedure that is legal in many places in the United States. And it is politically, this is something we believe should be completely, clearly outlawed at the federal level, because it is such— two reasons. Number one, it is so grotesque and evil. But secondly, a vast majority of Americans believe that it's so. So our question is, why would you turn that over to the states?
Okay. And so Trump's position, as I've understood it on abortion, is that it's the three— what are the three? The legal, safe, and— no, that's the Clinton Democrat position. He for him, it's life of the mother, incest, and rape where it should be accepted.
And incest. And the president focuses a lot on those exceptions and believes that it's very important, whatever the disagreement may be among conservatives about federal action or state-based action, that from his vantage point, that those exceptions occur.
Okay. And his position is also that it should be decided at the state level.
Yes, clearly.
So your main difference is that it shouldn't be— you think it should be federally outlawed.
The difference of opinion is precisely that.
Okay, but do you disagree with him on the case of incest, rape, and life of—
Project 2025 is clear that what we call for in terms of abortion restrictions would include those exceptions.
Oh, okay.
So really, the rub really is about federal versus state action.
I see. And national abortion ban, this is something that Kamala was banging on about throughout.
And it just doesn't exist in Project 2025. That's like the greatest lie that she committed about our work.
Might her understanding of your federal your position on it being federally outlawed be what she thinks is the national—
No, she was arguing, you would think, but she was arguing that no abortion could exist whatsoever. And in fact, even with a 15-week abortion ban, you would be eliminating about 2 or 3 or 4% of abortions in the United States. So it was a gross mischaracterization.
Okay. And then the other thing that jumped out to me, which will surprise British listeners, but I understand that this is happening in certain states, is you want to outlaw porn— or Project 2025, I think, wants to outlaw pornography. It's outlawed in Texas, right? Have I understood that correctly?
For minors and in a handful of other states.
Okay. And so it seems that even there's a Guardian write-up about it, and it's their contention.
But we can trust that.
Well, I only bring. Trust me, I don't like the Guardian. But if you think the reason I bring it up is if that's the worst impression you're going to get, right? This is the most negative journalist takedown that you're going to get of the Project 2025, and they brought up abortion and making pornography illegal basically as the things that they were most concerned about. What's the? I haven't looked into this pornography thing and making it illegal. What's the controversy? Why make it illegal? What's the case to make it illegal?
Well, our focus in Project 2025 and at Heritage is expanding the number of states that make it illegal for minors. And I think the case for that is, I think it's self-evident, but I'll make it here.
To use it, obviously.
To use it, to have access to it.
And 18.
Texas, Kentucky, a handful of other states have done that. Heritage Foundation and one of our Project 2025 partners, the American Principles Project, have been instrumental in getting that done. We believe that the damage here, just to make the case succinctly in case someone needs it, the damage done to minors is perhaps irreparable. There's a moral case to be made, but the case that we're making uses social science evidence that shows the rewiring of brains, both for young men and for young women. The habits that ensue as a result have very deleterious effects on them as individuals and on society writ large. And an honest conversation about what Project 2025 calls for regarding pornography would have been on that. So whether it was the Vice President, Kamala Harris, or whether it was a journalist with any outlet, if they wanted to have an intellectually honest conversation about the pros and cons of what we call for, it would have been using as an example the Texas pornography law. And because that didn't happen, it was very clear to us, along with their mischaracterizations of our position on abortion restrictions, that they weren't interested in intellectually honest conversation. They were interested in winning a political campaign. And ultimately what's happened, Winston, on these pornography laws at the state level, outlawing it for minors, is that they've become a lot more popular. Because Americans are realizing this is a scourge and it needs to come to an end.
What's another, I guess, criticism is, and this is classic leftist criticism, is that it's essentially a very Christian religious project. Do you think that that's a fair assessment? And I'm a Christian myself, so I don't think that's. I don't see that as a negative. But it's interesting to understand whether Project 20, how important it is. Reading your book, obviously, that is. It's the mooring of your ideology and your philosophy.
To the extent that people of faith participated in it. But one of the gross mischaracterizations of our work was that it's quote unquote Christian nationalism, whatever the hell that is. I still haven't had that defined. And the trope is that all of these policies are designed to create some, Christian theocracy or something like that. That is a total straw man. In fact, it's an even worse, more insidious straw man than the straw man that they built on our abortion ideas and the work that we've done on outlawing pornography for minors in states. Because ultimately what they're driving at is that you can't at once be both a person of faith and also do policy in the public square.
Interesting. And so the other big topic is immigration. Now, it's really interesting to see, particularly what Vice President-elect J.D. Vance achieved with immigration and changing the conversation, the zeitgeist around the conversation, because he claimed there was 25 million illegal immigrants. I've read this. My research put it at about 21, but regardless, he's talking about mass immigration. Him doing that in America has changed the conversation over here in Britain somewhat. It's like, it's actually... maybe we can talk about what that looks like when it comes to criminals and illegals. But this is a big part of Project 2025 as well. Have I understood that correctly?
It's a huge thrust. It's a big thrust of our work at Heritage. I mean, so much so that it wasn't a surprise to us that President Trump hired his friend and our Heritage fellow, Tom Homan, to be the so-called border czar.
Right.
And what's interesting is the politics on this, both in Britain and in the United States, are breaking the same way, which is to say that people in the center, on the right, on the left, are saying just apolitically what's going on with immigration, both illegal immigration and legal immigration, is ridiculous. That we're going to lose our nation states. Nothing against illegals as human persons, but we're going to lose our nation states if we don't get a handle on this. And in the United States, at least in the presidential election, that issue and the economy are what drove Trump's victory.
So, practically speaking, how is this going to be carried out? Because millions of people, like, it's all good and all to say we should do it, and if you've broken the law, there should be punishment for it. But how on earth are you going to? How is Tom Homan going to do that? Where's he going to send them to? How is he going to deport millions of illegal immigrants in America? Like, walk me through that.
Yeah. It's a tall order when you have, at least according to conservative estimates, 11 million illegal aliens in the United States. Some people estimate it to be 20 million or more.
Yeah.
So even the most robust, aggressive plan would take a while. I see 2 or 3 steps unfolding. Mr. Homan, on the first step, has been excellent on that, and that is the rhetoric around this. There needs to be a large percentage of these illegals who self-deport. And you ask the question, why would they self-deport? Well, they understand that the incoming administration is serious about steps 2 and 3, which I'll talk about momentarily. They understand that the gentleman who's been put in charge of it is an expert not just about the southern border, which is a problem, but is also a particular expert on interior enforcement. All but a few of our congressional districts have been beset with illegal alien problems, crime and other issues. So a lot of it is the messaging, and this is why Tom is doing so much media right now. But the second is to get to the substance of it. You've got to build the wall, have more drones on the southern border, hire more Border Patrol agents. You're not going to be able to build a wall across the entire southern border, but you can completely increase to a real robust enforcement, a much better system than what the Biden-Harris regime has done. And then the third thing is, to the point of interior enforcement, you have to have agents, federal agents from the what's called ICE, for interior enforcement, who are going into cities and counties, and we have to require the local law enforcement to comply. Right now, one of the issues, including in one of the counties that's right outside Washington, D.C., is that some of these George Soros-funded local law enforcement sheriffs and chiefs are not complying. I would expect Tom Homan and the Trump administration to fight them in court. It's that last step that I think will also be very effective.
Okay, and so then they get these illegal immigrants or illegal aliens, and we're talking. I mean, it's one thing to deport even 100,000, but millions, let's say. What's the next step? In Britain, for example, there's conversation about a Rwanda deal. You might have heard about it whilst you were here.
I've heard a little bit about that.
And are you going to send them? How are you going to work out where they might not have documentation. They might say they're from one place and not from another. To what country are you going to deport them to?
As I understand Tom Homan's first step on that part, they're going to focus on the criminals. I mean, 100% of these people have broken the law.
There are a lot of criminals,
but there are
violent criminals, right?
People don't realize what a significant problem that is. I mean, there have been at least 13,000 murders committed by illegal aliens in the United States in the last couple of years. And it's during the political campaign, to go back to the politics of this, the Harris campaign said, oh, this is a ridiculous exaggeration. If anything, President Trump was being conservative about the number. But I was talking to my colleagues at Heritage about this in the last week, and their estimate is right off the bat, 430,000 are criminals, not murderers necessarily, rapists, very serious felonious property crime. And those people are identified. And I think that the Tom Homan and his law enforcement guys will move them to southern Texas. The government of Texas just offered a 2,000-acre ranch to set up these detention camps for these men, mostly men, and a few women, and they will be moved south of the border. Part of the problem, Winston, is that
so they're going to Mexico. That's where they're going.
They've got to, and that's the hard part of this, because for us, constitutionally, militarily, the president of Mexico is no friend of any conservative administration, to say the least. And so that's where there will be a lot of challenges. Ultimately, there will be hundreds of thousands of illegal aliens, starting with the worst criminals, who are put on planes and buses and sent south of the border.
So there's got to be some sort of negotiation with the president of Mexico. And so he's not going to why would he want to take back hundreds of thousands of violent criminals?
She will not.
Oh, she will. Yeah.
There's the rub. And it's going to be a lot of fun and glorious and proper. And ultimately, the Trump-Vance administration has to do this because a big part of their victory has been driven by this.
Okay, well, that's going to be fun to watch. And those numbers, by the way, it's not just Heritage, that ICE themselves have put those figures.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Something like 500,000.
Well, Vice President Harris has never allowed facts to get in the way of a good opinion.
The borders are. Okay, cool. So, can you tell me a bit about the Heritage Foundation that you're the president of? Because I think that, we just heard everything about Project 2025. We heard everything about the Heritage Foundation, but I don't think people know. It's kind of nebulous, I think, to a lot of people. So how would you explain, aside from it being obviously a think tank, and you've got this talent, how J.D. Vance himself speaks so glowingly about it, but what's the inner workings? You're based in D.C., how big is the team? How would you describe it to someone?
We're a public policy organization. So like other think tanks, we research policies. We work on every policy issue in the United States and also have a significant international presence. There are about 350 full-time employees. We're the largest conservative think tank in the world, best as I can tell. We don't exist to be the largest, but we've become that over the last 50 years because in addition to doing research, what makes us distinctive is that we also advocate for it. And so in Washington, we have a team of lobbyists who go and advocate for good legislation and work against bad legislation. So rather than the sort of quasi-university approach of most think tanks, there's a component to our work which is really focused on action. In fact, we have a sister organization, which I also lead, called Heritage Action. Second point of distinction is that in addition to the work we do at the federal level, we also have a lot of activity in state capitals and state legislatures. And so what we're trying to do is, in the United States, revitalize federalism so that more policy action is coming from the states, making Washington less important. We actually think over the next 10 to 20 years, if that happens, you're going to see better policy. You're going to see far more American school children have real school choice. You're going to see much more constrained budgets. You're going to see ultimately an increase in freedom. The states tend to protect that better than the federal government has, at least in the last couple of generations. And then the last part, which you and I were talking about before we started our formal conversation, is that we're very active internationally. We're here in Britain often, across Europe, across the world. We have a big team of international scholars who've worked in a lot of presidential administrations. Perhaps some of them will be going back in. We'll see what president and the vice president have to say about that. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is not just revitalize the conservative movement writ large, but also to make sure that the emphasis on self-governance, on freedom properly understood, on economic deregulation are not just happening in the United States, but in as many societies across the world as we can.
So you saying that you're kind of, it's like the federalist dream. You want things to go back to the state, right? So, but it strikes me, and maybe this is an easy thing to square, but what you said earlier about abortion, you want it to be at the federal level. Isn't that a contradiction? I
understand why you would think it's a contradiction, but you're not. It's a fair question. Federalism isn't an either or question. It isn't that we want. So just take a step back from the particular issue for a moment. It isn't that we want the federal government to do 100%. It's that there is really a shared role in governance. And there are some issues like developing the military, most questions of immigration, to state the obvious, interstate commerce, where the federal government has preeminent power. States, according to the Dobbs decision of a couple of years ago, have a larger role in determining abortion policy, but they don't have 100% of the role, according to our legal analysis. There is some role for the federal government to do that.
Okay. And so then can I ask about these new appointees?
Sure.
So we've really discussed.
We'll see if I can answer it.
Tom Homan. Well, maybe you don't know them, but maybe some of you do. So as I've got it down as 5. This is only happened at the time of recording last couple of days. That 5 Project 2025 authors. There were about 20 total authors, right?
400 authors, 110
authors,
organizations.
Right. Okay, I got that completely wrong.
And most of them. No, you have no reason to know that. But
well, I should have.
A majority of them worked in the Trump administration, which is why.
Trump won.
Yeah, Trump won.
Okay, and so. There's 5 ones appointed so far for the Trump 2 administration. That's Brendan Carr, Russ Vought, Tom Homan, who we discussed, and John Ratcliffe and Pete Hoekstra. I'm sure I've mispronounced a few of those, or a couple of those. What can we start with Brendan Carr? He was he's been nominated to dismantle. Have I understood this right? So big tech companies too.
Yeah, the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. So Brendan, who is
dismantle the censorship cartel and restore free speech rights to everyday Americans.
He's already one of the 5 members of our FCC, our Federal Communications Commission, and he's one of 2 conservatives. President Trump's got the ability to appoint a chairman and basically flip the mindset of the FCC from being what we see to be anti-free speech, certainly pro-big tech, which those, of course, go hand in hand. And I think he's going to bring a lot of common sense to that role. He was one of the authors of Mandate for Leadership, the policy part of Project 2025. It's no surprise to us that President Trump would nominate him because, as I said earlier, great ideas and great people rise to the top. If you want someone who's thoughtful, wonderful legal scholar and attorney as well, and also, this is really important, it's a common thread through these appointments, Winston, has the ability to communicate why and how to the American people. Brendan was a sterling pick.
How's he going to do it? How this is so deep. It's something we have here on the show, and maybe you've had this problem with your show. We've had episodes demonetized by YouTube, and they'll stop pushing them if it's a too juicy a topic. And how would one start with that? I mean, the only successful attempt to do it has been Elon Musk buying Twitter, now X. What's Brendan Carr's going to do to actually, reduce censorship at these big tech giants?
Yeah, part of it is understanding the algorithm that Google in particular uses.
Oh,
and obviously, as a conservative, which includes a real belief in the free market, that's a sensitive topic. It is for Brendan, but as I understand it, getting a more transparent understanding of how that algorithm is used against us is vital. And as I have conversations on Capitol Hill in Washington with conservative members of Congress about this who are a little skeptical, I remind them that they are literally 99 times more likely to have a fundraising email for their campaign deleted, put into the junk folder if it is on Gmail. That's not a coincidence.
Oh, I hadn't even heard of that.
And so some of the details of Brendan's plans will come out in these hearings. That's how the FCC works. But just sort of philosophically, he wants to get to the root cause, or what seems to be, and it is it's this cudgel, which is the Google algorithm.
So if I can zoom out on this, and this is perhaps maybe where we'll agree on this. But my problem with the right, where I think the right goes too far, is that I don't believe in ultimate free, total free market. I'm not a libertarian in that sense.
But we agree on this.
Yeah. So the problem you have with total free markets is monopoly.
Exactly.
And once you have monopoly, you're on a straight train to corporate endgame, and as we saw with the Twitter files, also turns into fascism pretty quickly.
It does.
That's in cahoots with big government. So I'm not actually. That's where I'm quite different from conservatives and more of a liberal, I would say, or maybe I would say that's a traditional classical liberal position. But I think that's part of your philosophy.
It is. It's really well said. It's part of our thesis, which is that if you have completely unfettered free market, it can create a monopoly. And then what we also emphasize at Heritage, and this is perhaps even more relevant to some of the policy questions our Congress is dealing with right now, is that you don't have a free market. So let's say these aforementioned conservative members of our Congress, good men and women, believe, if Brendan Carr wants that algorithm, it violates the free market. We're not existing in a free market. What American policy has done is create this collusion, to your point, between big government and big business. And if I'm a small business owner or a medium-sized business owner, I'm so disadvantaged by what the big corporate guys do because they are in bed with big government. What we try to do at Heritage, what we've tried to do over the last few years in particular, is really press on that so that we can convince other people in our movement in the center right in the United States that it's okay to offer a critique of the free market, not because the philosophy per se is bad, but because a free market flows out of a healthy society. And when you don't have that, you get this fascism, as you put it, this collusion, as I more often call it.
Who was the great American president who did the antitrust stuff at with all the oil? Was
Teddy Roosevelt?
Was it Roosevelt?
Yeah.
So it's actually, and he was Democrat, right?
He was Republican. He was center right. He ran as a third-party candidate in 1912 under the Bull Moose Party. And he and J.D. Vance, philosophically, sort of intellectually, are kindred spirits. And so it's, to your point earlier that, this may be a heterodox position for you to state. Actually, it's got a long tradition in the United States, and it's only in the last 50 or 60 years that we've come to say the free market is the ultimate aim. It's a good. The way we talk about it at Heritage philosophically is we have competing goods here. The role of policymakers is to figure out which is the priority at a given time.
A quick interruption to your show. If you would like exclusive content, exclusive interviews, and exclusive videos, come over to the Winston Marshall Substack. It's at winstonmarshall.co.uk, and there you can interact with me directly. It's winstonmarshall.co.uk, and you'll find links in the comments below. But back to the interview. It seems to me this is one of the big battles on the right, or in conservatives, between just total free markets and limited free markets. So if you were to strongman the position for monopoly, what would that be? To
strongman it.
Yeah. What's the best case for monopoly?
Truly friends and a few of my colleagues who are more libertarian than conservatives, I say this respectfully, they would say it creates an efficiency that has a positive effect on prices, which is to say that it goes down, they go down at least initially. And that then, and they would often cite Google, if we're going to strongman this, I'll take this next step. They would say Google has, as a result, with this efficiency and this scale they have, actually spawned more innovation than if they were not a monopoly. Mm-hmm. And that's a point worthy of consideration. And so just real briefly, if I may, going back somewhat to your question about how Heritage does its work, when we are in meetings with elected officials, or for that matter, movement friends, and they give us this strongman position on this issue, well, then we go back and we work through that. And so we want a very considered position of why we're calling for the legislation that sometimes we help draft.
Okay. And so do you think that there's a hope with Trump too, that there'll be sort of an antitrust? The aim seems to be more about against government bureaucracy, but do you think antitrust is part of this movement?
I think it is. And the reason I say I think and not know is I'm not part of the administration. They will be able to speak for their priorities. But if you look at the appointments, you look at the appointee to be the Secretary of the Treasury, our friend Scott Bessent. Scott is someone who's had great success in capital markets and also is someone who has a more Alexander Hamiltonian position on tariffs. And so as part of this, he's going to be the leading figure on economic policy in the administration. We have, as we sit here and record this, we don't yet know who the U.S. trade representative is. If it's someone like Bob Lighthizer, who was in that role the last time, then you're going to see more of this explicitly anti-monopoly position, sort of Teddy Roosevelt position, personified by the vice president himself, really become evident in the administration.
That would be so exciting.
It would be.
Where are Democrats now? Would they support that? I mean, someone like Bernie would, right?
He would. He probably, well, not probably. He, at least for my taste, he would go too far. I think there's a happy medium here. But you would think that Democrats in Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Ohio, in all the states that were in the news because they were the swing states in our election, they're going to be more open to that conversation, if nothing else, because of the politics of their state.
Okay. And so of these other nominations, who are you most excited about? Russ Vought, John Ratcliffe, Pete Hoekstra. What can you tell me about?
Man, you're wanting me to pick winners and losers.
Well, yes. No, you don't. They're all winners.
They're all winners. They're all winners.
But who should listeners keep their eye on?
Russ Vought for sure.
Okay, and why is that?
Both because of who he is, as well as the position he has.
And his position is
he's director. Has been appointed to be director of the Office of Management and Budget, which sounds really boring. And if you don't like numbers, maybe it is. But this was a position that Russ had in the first Trump term. And it's an important position regardless of who occupies it, because basically that director and his or her staff can have their fingers in all aspects of the federal budget. And so if you've been elected, as Trump and Vance have, in part to rein in the expansive growth of the federal government, that position's important. And the second thing is Russ who's probably our closest collaborator on Project 2025 outside of Heritage, and he's a Heritage alumnus. is someone who is fearless. He's brilliant. He's done the job. He's an extremely virtuous guy. I think he's one of the statesmen of our age. And I think he is going to, taking the president's direction, be very courageous about where we can cut our budget. Because as we sit here, our federal debt is almost $36 trillion.
Yeah.
And while some people believe that we can grow ourselves out of that, which is to say the imposed subtle but powerful tax of inflation, the ordinary American says something's got to give. And the first thing that's got to give is the federal budget.
This is linked to the Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy, Doge project.
Very much so. And you think
they
about
want to cut it to a third of the costs. Right?
Yes, that's right. And God bless them. I mean, it's going to be an extra governmental agency, if you will. But I think they're going to generate a lot of ideas. In fact, over the last few days, they've been using a lot of heritage research, which doesn't surprise us because every year we issue a federal budget policy blueprint. And so both Elon and Vivek are homing in on that. Ultimately, where the potential challenge may be is that because it's not an official agency, what do the different cabinet secretaries do with that? Now, they're all very much aligned with the Trump agenda, from my great friend from Texas, Brooke Rollins, who will be the Secretary of Agriculture. Has a lot to do with farming, but also a lot to do with safety net programs that need some reforming, to Russ's position. But the great thing is that they're crowdsourcing these ideas, and the American people are very much involved. And we've never really had that, at least in modern history, where the American people believe so importantly, you've got to cut federal spending that dramatically in order to have the attendant or the result on inflation.
Is this what you see as this sort of second American Revolution? When
Precisely, yeah, precisely. And both in the sense of controlled burn and second American Revolution. I mean these things metaphorically. I have to explain that to my friends on the left, as you know.
I skipped that in the introduction. Yeah. Well, it might not have been a metaphor.
Well, actually, as an early American historian, the second American Revolution is not a metaphor in one way, and that is what I mean by that is following the American Revolution, the military part of it, the real revolution was regenerating institutions. And that's what was happening up and down the 13 states. And that's what we're doing right now in the United States, in addition to our politics and policy, is that individual Americans and communities across the country realize our local school, our local university, the Boy Scouts of America, they're all rotten to the core. It's time to build new ones.
And that's what you get into in your book. So we'll come to that. And there's one man who's not, as far as I've understood, affiliated with Project 2025 or the Heritage, or maybe he is, but I understand he's a friend of yours. He's just been appointed Secretary of State, Mark Rubio.
Yes.
Now, this is curious to me, right? Because as far as I've understood Mark Rubio, and you tell me if I'm wrong, but he's kind of more of a traditional neocon. He's a China hawk. And so for me, it's a kind of curious nomination in the America First MAGA movement, that the Secretary of State it's probably not a hugely different position to Blinken necessarily, in that he's a neocon. Can you explain that to me? What do I misunderstand about Rubio, or how does that what seems to me from the outside an unlikely fit? How does that work?
Yeah, follow your question. I think the big thing to introduce to your understanding is that Senator Rubio, like a lot of us, myself included, has evolved from a pretty traditional neoconservative foreign policy person to someone who is much more skeptical about the American interventionism of the last 25 years. In fact, as you may know, Winston Heritage has I think been the leading organization inside Washington policy circles on calling for a reset. And what Senator Rubio has done, evidenced by speeches he's given on the floor, some votes he's taken, I think in particular, a very skeptical position he's taken on Ukraine military aid more recently, has a foot in both worlds. He has a foot in the world of the neoconservatives, and he has a foot in the world of the skeptics, the prioritizers, as my friend Elbridge Colby puts it. And on that
Elbridge has just been... Is he second in command as secretary? What's Elbridge's position?
As we sit here, I don't know that, but we're rooting for him because he's brilliant. And if that is the case, then that's a sign of what I was going to convey, which is that I actually think it's a brilliant pick by Trump, showing that he wants, rather than pick a side there, he wants to keep the conservatives together on this issue. And I think that's smart, not just politically, but probably also in substance. In a lot of ways, it's what Heritage has tried to do, where we're saying two things can be true at once. We want the Ukrainians to win, but how we've gone about aiding them is just absurd.
And I guess what Trump's victory is such a broad coalition of different. It's actually unbelievably pluralist.
It's remarkable, actually.
Compared to as a side point, but I saw Obama last week put a message out where he's holding some sort of pro-pluralist conference, but I interpret that as him saying the classic anti-populist stance is that populism is anti-pluralist. But if I look at the MAGA movement, I'm like, it's far more pluralist than the Democrat movement was certainly in this.
It's so true. I mean, I think one of the problems for the left in the United States, just philosophically, is their homogeneity. And, inside the political right in the United States, we know this at Heritage because we try to work with all of the different tribes and factions of conservatism. There's always a spirit to debate. At Heritage itself, we have a one voice policy. We're not going to ask for people to support our work to go get legislation passed and speak out of both sides of our mouth. And so even in our daily work at Heritage, we're having these spirited conversations. That isn't happening on the left. And that's ultimately, it can be powerful for them when they get a coordinated message like they did targeting us with Project 2025. But in the medium and long run, I think it's a real challenge for them if that doesn't change.
Yeah, it's curious because, again, you'll know this is your country, not mine. But I look at the left and it seems like there's a kind of unnatural alliance between the woke left, the sort of socialist populist Bernie left, the woke left maybe being AOC and the quad. What are they called?
Squad. Yeah.
The squad, forgive me.
Hard to remember.
And then there's the sort of neocon establishment, whatever what Biden sort of.
It's what I call the uniparty in the book.
The uniparty. So when you say uniparty, you don't include any Republican aspect of that. You're referring to the Democrats.
No, I am referring to what we call the Washington establishment or the swamp. Probably personified by Senator Mitch McConnell.
But on the left though, so you say there's a homogeneity. There's certainly a homogeneity in what you can and cannot say. But it seems that there's different factions that are not homogenous. In fact, they're very uncomfortable bedfellows, and that's why it's quite interesting keeping an eye on which direction they take next, because it's not clear path. It didn't work, this coalition, for this election. So they can't carry on this way, right?
Yes, I agree with that. I do think it's right that they're homogenous in terms of what they can say and where they can be, sometimes quite literally where they can be. But I was referring to where they can be on a policy issue. But when you peel that back, that is a not just tense, but sort of torturous coalition. And Harris couldn't keep it together in the way that Biden was able to keep that coalition together. They've got some big decisions to make about how they keep their coalition together. In particular, the voters who in the last couple of weeks of the presidential election who ended up swinging to Trump are people who typically would be in a center-left coalition. And Biden was able to keep them together because over his career, he's probably been part of any one of those factions. Harris was trying to mimic that, but was so inauthentic in doing so because she's decidedly in the faction of the woke left that she couldn't pull it off.
Yeah, my observation of Kamala, and please, I say this because I want your opinion, so you can tell me where I'm right or wrong, is that you listen to some of the things she was saying through the election and you're like, oh my God, she's a moron. Having said that, given that she was trying to balance these different factions, it might not be that she was that dumb, but that she had to tread and weave such a delicate path to not piss off any faction that she ended up being not able to talk a lot of the time because you could just see if you say that, these people get pissed off. You say that, these people get pissed off. So she kind of ended up not saying much or saying kind of ridiculous things.
You could really see that, and probably
which means that she's not that dumb, but she's not not bright enough in the same way that Obama could pull it off.
I'll leave the assessment of her intellect to other in the spirit of charity. But I will say that at least to me, the most obvious example of this dynamic that you point out, whatever her intellect is, I think you're spot on, was her selection of Tim Walz to be her running mate. For members of your audience who are not familiar with him, not familiar with modern Minnesota, it's the dystopia that the radical left has created. It's been on that trajectory for a long time, unfortunately, because of liberal policies. And he accentuated that with really overwrought lockdowns about COVID. He was literally the worst governor on that issue. And to your point,
what did he do? What was his?
He not only extended these lockdowns far longer than almost any state except California and New York, he had law enforcement go out very proactively and require people to stay in their homes. And I can just tell you from this adopted Texan and conservative, those are fighting words in the United States. But she selected him in spite of someone she probably should have selected politically, and that's Governor Shapiro of Pennsylvania, who is very popular. I disagree with his policies. He's very popular. He's a very good politician. He may very well be their nominee in 2028. Why couldn't she do that? Because he's Jewish.
Really? You think so?
I'm convinced of it. And there's some evidence.
Why are you convinced of it?
I'm convinced of it because all of the signs pointed to selecting him, especially leading up to that. And, all of the political money, figurative money was on him even the day before the announcement was made. And some of us believed that because of the fragile coalition that exists for the Democrats, historically, between American Jews and some Arab American voters in places like Michigan, that the vice president decided she couldn't lose those Arab American voters in Michigan.
That she lost anyway.
Who she lost anyway, by selecting Governor Shapiro.
Okay, so the other theory I had about that, and it was just a theory, was that Shapiro saw it as a losing ticket anyway and was like, you know what, I'm not interested. Which I imagine Newsom, because it was Shapiro and Newsom were the other two people that everyone expected, right, to be the picks.
Yeah, Shapiro was really the leading candidate that most people thought. And look, mine's a theory, and it may have been that Governor Shapiro said, I'm not interested, but this reality of any Democrat leader at the national level having to tiptoe around that coalition, that's much more delicate for them right now, much more sensitive, perhaps even impossible for them than it is on the center right. Now, how President-elect Trump governs, and I'm very optimistic about that, will really determine how much stronger the center-right coalition he's built becomes.
If you were for the next, who do you think would be the most formidable leader of the Democrats? Do you think Shapiro? They're going to obviously be doing some soul searching as and they're going to be on an interesting journey, and we're all going to be paying close attention. But what's their most likely path to success, do you think, for the Democrats?
I hate to give them advice.
You hate to give them advice?
I hate to give them advice.
I'm sure you do.
But if I were them, I would start with someone who's not in Washington. So that'd be a governor. And among the governors, Shapiro, to me, stands out as the most obvious. Someone might say Governor Newsom, and there would be an argument to be made there because he's a national figure already. He's very good in media. He's very slick. But I think Shapiro, in terms of policy substance, is more in the mold of Biden, who, of course, even though I disagree with almost everything he's done and says, was able to keep this center-left coalition together. I think Shapiro's got the best chance of doing that.
Well, we can only speculate, I guess, at this point.
It's a long ways away.
So I know it's taken a while to get through this interview before we actually address.
This is all just a tease.
Yes, this is all a tease to your book, Dawn's Early Light: Taking Back Washington to Save America. Although I think a lot of what we've discussed is kind of thematic in the book. And there was a few things that interested me. And let's address the Bernie institutions dam, which you now say is a metaphor. But of course, this is a lot of what Elon's been talking about and clearing out the bureaucratic state. And so maybe start at the beginning for someone who's just coming in at this, a listener who might be like, Bernie institutions dam, what on earth does that mean?
Well, I'm an outdoorsman, and I use this metaphor of a controlled burn, which in the United States is the terminology we use for our Forest Service, particularly in the American West, where I've spent a lot of time hunting and fishing and hiking, to burn the dead wood for the health of the remaining trees, the largest trees, but it's also a very important part of preventing forest fires. Both for that reason, as well as for the reason of the reality is that we're not using enough controlled burns in our forests. So just bear with me for 30 seconds. That actually is what has caused all of these forest fires, not so-called climate change, is that you've got all this dead wood that just becomes huge, huge fuel. And so I decided to take this metaphor and apply it to something I've studied as a historian, social scientist, and that is the health of institutions. And so I look at public schools, universities, Boy Scouts of America, news outlets like the New York Times, and I think so many of them are lost. We need to apply this metaphor of a controlled burn. And the way that would look like literally is obviously not striking a match, but just saying, I'm done with them. I'm not giving money to my alma mater. I'm not sending my kids to that public school. I'm going to go start my own. Or maybe some of them are salvageable. And so let me get on the school board. Let me maintain my subscription at XYZ newspaper, but talk to the editor. That ultimately is going to determine the success of the Trump-Vance realignment, even more than the great work I believe they're going to do in their administration. In other words, they have to have individual Americans saying, I'm going to pay more attention to my local communities, my local institutions, than I am to Washington policy.
What do you think is going to be their biggest challenge? Who, presumably, this bureaucratic behemoth is going to have its backup and it's going to push back, right?
The money on the outside that's adjacent to the bureaucrats, what we commonly refer to as K Street. K Street is a street in Northwest Washington where all of the lobbying firms are. And those lobbying firms are, for the most part, receive money. This is all legal. Some of it probably shouldn't be, but they receive money to continue the largesse of the federal government. Some of these firms even receive money from the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that's going to be the biggest obstacle for the president and vice president, and they will literally be able to see some of these firms' offices from the White House, because whereas a senator or a member of our House, especially if they're Republicans, need to at least feign loyalty to Trump and Vance, those firms on the outside can run messaging campaigns that undermine the agenda.
I am assuming that you finished this book before the election.
I did.
But you talk about the Second American Revolution that we've already hinted at in this. You're presumably then thinking about the MAGA movement as that second.
I am.
Give me the optimist take. Let's say you're speaking to someone who's hates Trump, hates MAGA. Why is this the second revolution? Why will they come out? I mean, I guess the case you're making is that in posterity they'll look back as this was the moment things were turned around. Can you make that case? How is that so?
I can strongman that.
Yeah, please.
I firmly believe that the Trump-Vance victory is the most important presidential election victory in at least a century, because of the emphasis on returning the country to normal, returning the country to be common sense. And a few examples of what I mean by that are they won this election in addition to good economic policies and policies on closing the border because they're fighting the transgender ideology. They're explicitly fighting the woke left. And Americans, and this is driving at the core point, Americans who are either apolitical or maybe even center left said, yeah, maybe I don't like Trump. Maybe I'm not a Republican, but that makes a hell of a lot of sense to me. And I want my country back. And so we've done these focus groups at Heritage over the last 18 months, and Americans from all kinds of demographic groups, left to right, Black, Hispanic, white, men, women, say, I want to wake up in a normal country. There's more to this realignment than just waking up in a normal country, but what does it require for us to say that in 5 or 10 or 20 years? That, yeah, federal government is smaller, that states have some more power, that the economy is better, but ultimately, this is the most important measure, that a majority of Americans say the American dream is something I can achieve. For the first time since Gallup and Pew started doing that poll almost 100 years ago, a minority of Americans in the last 2 years have said that's possible. I think maybe even as soon as a year or two into the Trump-Vance administration, that will flip. And the real test will be, can they sustain that? Not just for political purposes of winning elections, but for Americans to say, in spite of all the reasons we have to be discouraged, we're actually in the process of taking the country back. It's going to take a while, but it's possible.
And if they achieve that, they could be in power for a long time.
A very long time.
So another important aspect of the book is bringing back everything to the family. This seems to be that it's an important part of your philosophy, and maybe you could paint a picture of how much America's lost that sense of family. Have things been yanked away from the family?
Yes, I'll mention two things. One is just obvious data, which of course you know in Britain all too well, which is the decline in marriage rates and birth rates. Those are real existential problems. What I'm really getting at by talking about what I call a family first fusionism is a reference to a 1950s, 1960s effort among American conservatism, fusionism, which united foreign policy conservatives, social conservatives, and free market conservatives. Nothing against any of those people. But what I'm saying is we need a family first fusionism where in terms of our federal policy, we end, hopefully next year, the 2 or 3 major disincentives to Americans being married. I mean, literally in our tax code, there are disincentives to this. We also end in our safety net programs the incentive for young women, to have children out of wedlock. And beyond that, and I think J.D. Vance personifies this, but God bless Donald Trump for bringing this to life, that as conservatives, we no longer say, when we're given the question about a certain policy, free market first. We say that's a good, but it has to be considered with these other goods, namely, primarily, what's good for the American family, starting with working class families. And I think we're on the brink of that. It will require some more work, not just in terms of policy among the elected officials, but particularly for those of us who are in the intellectual part of the movement. There's some more thinking that has to be refined, but Heritage is trying to do its job by issuing a family policy paper and showing what's possible by understanding the trade-offs of all of these goods.
One of the, I guess you would say, pro-family policies that Trump campaigned on, and Kamala was quick on his heels to basically echo the same thing, was being pro-IVF and saying that the state would pay for IVF, which I love as someone who's pro-human and wants more life and more human life on the earth. My concern with that, and forgive me, this is a super arcane point to make right now, is that if you make it state-sponsored, that families and women will then, as a consequence, wait longer to have children because they might think, oh, I can have IVF, not knowing necessarily that IVF is, well, it's expensive, but that's, I guess, would be for the state to pay, but also is not a sure bet in the least, and it's a painful and very, very difficult process that anyone who's gone through it can attest. Is that something that is? What's your take on that?
We completely appreciate President Trump's motivation, which is to adopt this policy for the purposes of being more pro-family. We have real concerns about how much that industry exploits women and also viable human life, fetuses. And so what we're hopeful is that we can have a conversation as a family, center-right family, about that, which is to acknowledge the great motivation while also understanding there's some real problems we have to work through that about the industry itself.
Dr. Roberts, I've read probably about a third of the book before.
You're very kind.
And I enjoyed it, and it interlaces your own personal journey as well. I hope that we can have another conversation because there's aspects I want to talk about. I'm very interested about Pat Buchanan. You're campaigning for him, and he's someone that keeps coming up in a curious way. But I hope we can have another conversation anytime. We've had a wide-ranging conversation now. Is there any loose ends that you want to tie together? Any other things that you'd like the listener to understand before we bring this conversation to a close?
Just one, in addition to gratitude for the conversation, and that is, we are going to take back America. And it's going to be in part because of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, but most of all, it's going to be because 80 million Americans decided that the gig is up. And I'm also have enough faith in my fellow Americans who voted the other way that they will realize that they can be part of this movement as well. And when that happens, not if, we look forward to, in gratitude, repaying our British friends for everything y'all have done for us. And I'm optimistic, therefore, not just about the American future, but about the British future.
What have we done for you?
Our greatest allies in the history of our country.
I really appreciate you saying that.
It's heartfelt.
We feel gratitude towards. I'm going to sound all gushy, but we love America deeply and feel completely indebted to you. And
the feeling's mutual.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I know that your president-elect certainly is an Anglophile, so that's very encouraging. Given that I'm not particularly convinced that our own prime minister is an Anglophile.
It's an open question.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts. Thank you so much for your time. All the best with your book, Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America, and all the best with the Heritage Foundation. And let's do it again.
I look forward to it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for watching The Winston Marshall Show with Dr. Kevin D. Roberts, president of the Heritage Foundation. If you want to support this show, I remind you, all you have to do is press like and subscribe. If you do that, I'm going to have more phenomenal guests like Dr. Roberts exploring the issues you want to hear about and the mainstream media won't touch. But until next time, be well.